They found Lord Malcolm Fraser slumped in his study on a December morning in 1931, surrounded by architectural drawings and unpaid invoices, a revolver in his hand. The room overlooked the unfinished east wing of Castle Ridgefield, its skeletal steel frame rusting in the Scottish mist like the ribcage of some magnificent, dying beast. In his final letter, hastily scrawled on the back of a contractor's demand for payment, he wrote only this: "The stone demanded more than I possessed. May God forgive my vanity." The castle he had poured his family's fortune into, every penny accumulated over 3 generations, stood incomplete, a monument not to triumph but to the dangerous seduction of architectural ambition. What drives a man to sacrifice everything, his wealth, his family's security, even his life, for a building that would never be finished? Castle Ridgefield was never meant to be just another country house. Malcolm Fraser envisioned it as Scotland's answer to Blenheim Palace, a structure so magnificent that it would elevate the Fraser name from respectable wool merchants to the very pinnacle of British aristocracy. From the moment he inherited his father's textile empire in 1919, Malcolm had been consumed by a singular obsession: to build something that would outlast memory itself. He had grown up watching his father, Duncan Fraser, work 16-hour days in the mills of Glasgow, accumulating wealth but never respect from the landed gentry who looked down upon trade. Duncan had bought the Ridgefield estate in 1895, a modest 17th-century manor house on 800 acres of Highland moorland, hoping it would grant his son entry into a world that had always excluded him. But for Malcolm, the old house was an embarrassment, a constant reminder of his family's commercial origins. He wanted to erase it entirely, to replace it with something so breathtaking that no one would remember the Frasers had ever been anything but aristocrats. The man Malcolm hired to realize this impossible dream was Sir Edmund Halsey, one of Britain's most celebrated architects, known for his extravagant Edwardian country houses that blended Scottish baronial style with French chateau grandeur. Halsey was in his 60s by 1920, his reputation established, his fees astronomical. He took the commission not because he needed the money, but because Malcolm's vision appealed to his ego. Here was a client who wanted no compromises, no practical limitations, no budget constraints. "Build me something," Malcolm told him at their first meeting, "that makes Balmoral look modest." Halsey smiled and began to sketch. What emerged over the next 18 months of planning was architectural madness disguised as genius. The final designs called for a castle of 147 rooms, with a facade stretching nearly 400 feet, crowned by 7 towers of varying heights, the tallest reaching 160 feet into the Highland sky. The entrance hall alone was to be larger than most parish churches, its ceiling a barrel vault painted with scenes from Scottish mythology, supported by columns of Carrara marble shipped from Italy. There would be a ballroom capable of hosting 500 guests, a library to house 50,000 volumes, a winter garden enclosed in cast iron and glass imported from Paris, a chapel with stained glass windows commissioned from the same workshop that had restored Westminster Abbey, and a great dining hall modeled after the medieval banqueting rooms of Scottish kings. The plans included everything: an indoor swimming pool lined with Portuguese tiles, a private observatory in the North Tower, a theatre seating 200, stables for 40 horses, a garage for 20 motorcars, quarters for 100 servants, and a network of underground tunnels connecting every building on the estate so staff could move invisibly, never disturbing the family with their presence. But it was the construction itself that revealed the true scale of Malcolm's ambition. Halsey specified that the castle be built entirely of granite quarried from the estate itself, believing that a great house should literally rise from the land it commanded. Malcolm purchased pneumatic drilling equipment from America, hired expert quarrymen from Aberdeen, and opened a massive quarry on the northern edge of his property. The sound of explosives echoed across the moors daily as workers blasted stone from the earth. The granite was a beautiful warm gray, flecked with pink and black, but it was also brutally hard to work. Each block had to be precisely cut and dressed by hand before it could be laid. A single carved window surround could take a master mason 2 weeks to complete. The castle, Halsey calculated, would require approximately 45,000 tons of dressed stone. At the rate the quarry could produce, even working at full capacity, the supply alone would take 7 years. The foundation ceremony in April 1921 was a spectacle of calculated grandeur. Malcolm invited everyone who mattered in Scottish society, neighbouring landowners, politicians, industrialists, even minor royalty. A platform was erected on the site, draped in Fraser tartan. A piper played as Malcolm laid the ceremonial first stone, a massive block of granite inscribed with his family crest and the date, while 200 workers watched from a respectful distance. In his speech, Malcolm quoted Walter Scott and spoke of legacy, of building something worthy of Scotland's heritage, of creating beauty in an age increasingly dominated by industrial ugliness. The assembled guests applauded politely, sipped champagne from crystal glasses, and whispered to each other about Fraser's hubris. They had seen men like this before, merchants playing at being lords, and they knew how such stories usually ended. But in those early years, the impossible seemed achievable. The site became a small city unto itself. Over 400 men worked on Castle Ridgefield at the height of construction: stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, scaffolders, glaziers, metalworkers, painters, excavation crews, and an army of laborers who hauled materials and mixed mortar and dug trenches for the complex network of plumbing and heating systems that would make the castle modern despite its medieval appearance. Malcolm built a temporary village of wooden barracks to house the workers, a dining hall that served 3 meals a day, even a small hospital with a full-time nurse. He paid wages above the regional average, believing that well-compensated men would work with greater care and pride. In the villages surrounding Ridgefield, the castle became the economic engine. Local businesses thrived supplying the site. Blacksmiths forged ironwork, joiners crafted doors and paneling in their workshops, women took in laundry from the work camp. For a brief moment, Malcolm Fraser was not just building a castle, he was a benefactor, a source of prosperity. The castle rose from its foundations with agonizing slowness. By the end of 1922, only the basement level and the beginning of the ground floor walls were complete. The work was staggering in its complexity. The basement alone contained the mechanical heart of the building: boiler rooms with furnaces large enough to heat the entire structure, vast kitchens with ranges and ovens built to feed 100 people, wine cellars with capacity for 10,000 bottles, cold storage rooms, laundries, workshops, and storage vaults. Miles of copper pipe were laid for hot and cold running water in every bathroom and dressing room. Electrical wiring was run through specially designed conduits in the walls, an innovation Halsey insisted upon, though many of the older builders distrusted electricity and predicted disaster. A generating plant was constructed in a separate building behind the stable block, its diesel engines providing power independent of any municipal supply. Every decision Malcolm made prioritized quality and permanence, regardless of cost. He believed he was building something that would stand for centuries, a monument that would carry the Fraser name through generations yet unborn. But there were signs, early and unmistakable, that the project was consuming resources faster than even Malcolm's considerable fortune could sustain. The wool business that funded everything was thriving in the immediate post-war years, but it required constant attention, investment, and management. Malcolm had neither the time nor the interest to oversee it properly. He had installed managers to run the mills, but he made decisions from Ridgefield, often without fully understanding the changing market conditions. The textile industry was becoming increasingly competitive. Cheaper wool was flooding in from Australia and New Zealand. Labor costs were rising as unions gained power. Profit margins that had seemed unassailable in his father's time were steadily shrinking. Malcolm withdrew vast sums from the business accounts to pay construction bills, weakening the company's capital reserves. His accountants warned him repeatedly. His mill managers pleaded with him to reinvest in modernizing the equipment and expanding production capacity. Malcolm ignored them all. The castle had become his only concern, his magnificent obsession. By 1924, the walls of the main structure had reached the first floor, and the sheer scale of the building was finally visible across the landscape. Travelers on the road that skirted the estate would stop their motorcars to stare at the rising fortress, its granite walls glowing amber in the evening light, its towers beginning to puncture the skyline. Photographers came from London and Edinburgh to document the construction, and articles began appearing in architectural journals marveling at the ambition of the project. One writer described it as a cathedral of domesticity, a dwelling place built with the reverence and scale usually reserved for the glory of God. Malcolm clipped these articles obsessively, pasting them into leather-bound scrapbooks, reading them late at night when exhaustion made sleep impossible. He needed their validation. He needed proof that he was creating something important, something that justified the mounting costs and the sleepless nights spent reviewing invoices he could barely afford to pay. But fame came with scrutiny, and not all the attention was flattering. Critics began to question the project's excess in a nation still recovering from war, where unemployment remained high and poverty widespread. One particularly scathing editorial in a Glasgow newspaper asked whether it was moral for one man to command the labor of hundreds to build a pleasure palace of absurd proportions, while families in the city's slums lived in conditions that would have shamed medieval serfs. Malcolm read such criticism with fury and wounded pride, but he never seriously considered abandoning or scaling back the project. To stop now would be to admit defeat, to validate everything his father had feared about reaching above one station. He was trapped by his own vision, unable to turn back, unable to see any path forward except completion. The workforce at Ridgefield had its own culture, its own hierarchies and tensions. The skilled tradesmen, the stonemasons, carpenters, and metalworkers, were proud men, many from families who had worked in construction for generations. They respected the quality of the work they were producing and took genuine satisfaction in their craftsmanship. But they also resented the project's extravagance. They saw the marble imported from Italy and wondered why good Scottish stone wasn't sufficient. They watched enormous sums spent on decorative flourishes and thought of their own children's threadbare clothes and meager meals. The common laborers, many of them men who had survived the trenches of France and Flanders, worked for the wages and nothing more. They had learned during the war that grand visions conceived by wealthy men usually demanded blood. Here, at least, the sacrifice was only sweat and time, though there were accidents, of course. Men fell from scaffolding. Stones crushed fingers and toes. One young mason, a boy of 19 from Inverness, was killed when a derrick cable snapped and a granite block crashed down on him. Malcolm paid for the funeral and gave the family £100, but he never visited the site on the day they carried the boy's body away. He couldn't bear to witness the human cost. The year 1925 brought Malcolm both his greatest hope and his most devastating blow. In February, his wife Catherine gave birth to their third child, a son they named Duncan after Malcolm's father. For weeks, Malcolm spoke of little else, imagining the boy growing up within the completed castle, inheriting not just wealth but legacy, a place in society that Malcolm had spent everything to secure. But in June, Catherine took ill. What began as a persistent cough developed into pneumonia. The doctors came from Edinburgh, the best Malcolm's money could hire, but medicine in 1925 was still limited. Antibiotics did not exist. They could only make her comfortable, keep her warm, and hope. She died on a rainy morning in early July, in the old manor house that Malcolm had planned to demolish the moment the castle was habitable. He was with her at the end, holding her hand, and witnesses later said that his grief was absolute and terrifying to behold. He did not cry. He simply sat beside her body for hours, silent and motionless, until his sister finally convinced him to let the undertakers do their work. Catherine's death changed Malcolm in ways that everyone around him could observe but none could articulate. He had always been driven, but now he became manic, almost desperate. The castle was no longer just an ambition, it became a memorial, the only way he knew to honor her memory and justify the sacrifices his obsession had already demanded. He spent even longer hours at the construction site, sometimes sleeping in a small office he had set up in one of the completed basement rooms. He drove the workers harder, demanded faster progress, grew furious at delays he once would have accepted as inevitable. He ordered the construction of Catherine's memorial chapel begun immediately, even though it meant diverting resources from the main structure. The chapel was to be a small jewel of stone and stained glass adjacent to the castle's east wing, a place where she could be properly interred and where he could come to feel close to her again. The stained glass alone cost £6,000, depicting scenes of Scottish saints and angels with faces that, if one looked closely, bore a resemblance to Catherine's delicate features. But the cost of grief, added to the cost of ambition, was devastating to Malcolm's finances. By late 1926, the construction invoices exceeded his available liquid capital. He began borrowing, first from banks in Glasgow who were eager to lend against the collateral of his textile business, then from private lenders at increasingly unfavorable terms. The wool mills, now neglected entirely, were struggling. A national textile strike in 1926 shut down production for 3 months. Markets were shifting, demand was falling, and Malcolm was too preoccupied to respond effectively. His managers resigned in frustration, replaced by less competent men who lacked the authority to make necessary decisions. The company's debts grew while its revenue declined. Yet still, the castle rose. The roof was beginning to take shape, a complex arrangement of turrets and battlements and slate that required master craftsmen and endless patience. The great hall's hammer-beam ceiling, each beam carved with intricate Celtic knotwork, was assembled piece by painstaking piece. The marble columns in the entrance hall were erected, their veined surfaces catching light in ways that took the breath away even in the building's unfinished state. It was magnificent, undeniably, heartbreakingly magnificent. The workers noticed the changes before anyone else. In early 1927, wage payments began arriving late. At first, only by a day or two, then by a week, then by 2 weeks. Malcolm would appear, apologize, promise that it was merely a temporary difficulty with bank transfers, and produce enough cash to satisfy the men, at least for a while. But confidence was eroding. Suppliers became reluctant to deliver materials on credit. Some refused to continue without cash in advance. The pace of construction, which had been steady if slow, began to stall. Whole weeks would pass with little progress as workers waited for materials that didn't arrive or wages that were overdue. Some of the men quit, finding work elsewhere or returning to their home villages. Others stayed, out of loyalty or necessity or simply because they wanted to see the building completed. They had invested years of their lives in Castle Ridgefield, it felt unthinkable to abandon it unfinished. Malcolm's financial situation grew increasingly desperate throughout 1928 and 1929. He sold assets, a London townhouse he had purchased years earlier, a collection of rare books, stocks and bonds, even personal jewelry that had belonged to Catherine. He attempted to secure additional loans, but banks that had once courted him now turned him away. They had examined the books of Fraser Textiles and seen a company in decline, overburdened with debt, hemorrhaging money. The only substantial asset was the Ridgefield estate itself, and no one wanted to lend against a half-finished castle that would be nearly impossible to sell. In desperation, Malcolm approached potential buyers, hoping someone else might want to complete his vision and allow him to retain some involvement. But no one had the resources or the madness to take on such a project. The economic optimism of the mid-1920s was fading. Cautious investors sensed instability in the markets, though few predicted the catastrophic crash that came in October 1929. The Great Depression destroyed Malcolm Fraser utterly. The value of his remaining assets collapsed overnight. Fraser Textiles, already weakened, could not survive the economic devastation that followed the crash. Orders vanished. Credit evaporated. In early 1930, the company declared bankruptcy, its mills sold to creditors for a fraction of their value, its workers, many of whom had been with the Fraser family for decades, dismissed with nothing more than a week's wages and sympathy. Malcolm lost everything except the Ridgefield estate itself, which was protected by the terms of the original purchase as family property, unsaleable without the consent of all heirs. But the protection was hollow. He had no income, no means to pay the construction crews who had not been paid in months, no way to settle the enormous debts he had accumulated with material suppliers and contractors. In March 1930, construction at Castle Ridgefield stopped. Not gradually, not with a formal announcement, but simply ground to a halt as if the building itself had died. The workers gathered their tools, said quiet farewells to each other, and walked away. Some cursed Malcolm Fraser as they left, calling him a fool and worse. Others felt only sadness, mourning the loss of something beautiful they had poured their skill and sweat into creating. The site fell silent. The castle stood perhaps 70% complete, the main structure was enclosed, the roof was on most sections, many of the interior rooms were plastered and fitted, but vast areas remained unfinished. The east wing, the section Malcolm had been viewing from his study on the morning of his death, was barely more than a steel skeleton clad in partial stonework, open to the weather. The grand staircase existed only as wooden scaffolding indicating where the marble steps would eventually rise. The ballroom was a cavernous space of bare stone walls and exposed ceiling joists. The winter garden was a rusting framework of iron with shattered panes of glass scattered across its floor. The chapel, Catherine's memorial, was roofed and enclosed but lacked the interior furnishings, the altar, the pews, even the floor tiles that would have made it complete. Malcolm rattled around the old manor house with his 3 children, cared for by a single elderly housekeeper who stayed more out of pity than duty. His sister Margaret begged him to leave Ridgefield, to take the children somewhere they could start over, perhaps to Canada or Australia where the Fraser name meant nothing and he might rebuild a modest life. But Malcolm refused. Leaving would mean admitting that everything he had sacrificed, his father's legacy, his fortune, his wife's happiness, his children's security, had been for nothing. He spent his days wandering through the unfinished castle, walking its empty corridors, running his hands over the carved stonework, standing in the magnificent entrance hall where his footsteps echoed in the silence. Witnesses said he talked to himself, or perhaps to Catherine, explaining, justifying, seeking forgiveness for failures too vast to name. The final months were a descent into darkness visible to everyone who knew him. Malcolm stopped eating regularly, stopped bathing, stopped engaging with his children in any meaningful way. He became gaunt and wild-eyed, haunted. His correspondence from this period, preserved in family archives, reveals a man wrestling with profound guilt and existential despair. In one letter to Margaret, he wrote, "I believed I was building something permanent, something that would give meaning to our name and security to generations unborn. Instead, I have constructed a monument to vanity, a tomb for our family's future. The stones do not forgive. They only endure, mocking the foolish pretensions of the men who cut them." He pawned what little remained of value to buy food for his children and pay the housekeeper's wages. Creditors circled like vultures, filing lawsuits he lacked the resources to defend against. The legal proceedings ground forward with bureaucratic indifference, and it became clear that the estate itself would eventually be seized and sold to satisfy his debts. On December 12, 1931, Malcolm Fraser walked across the frozen grounds to the unfinished castle for the last time. It was early morning, the Highland winter dark and bitter cold. He let himself into the building through a side entrance, climbed the temporary wooden stairs to the second floor where his study was meant to have been, and sat at a makeshift desk someone had left behind. The room was unfurnished, unheated, open to the wind that whistled through gaps around the windows. Before him stretched the view he had imagined enjoying in his old age, the estate's grounds, the distant mountains, and in the foreground, the skeletal east wing, its rusting steel beams a brutal reminder of dreams unrealized. He wrote his final letter, just those 2 sentences, and then he ended his life. A groundskeeper found him that afternoon, slumped in the chair, the revolver fallen to the floor, frost beginning to form on his coat. The scandal was immediate and sensational. Newspapers across Britain covered the story, often with barely concealed satisfaction at the downfall of an ambitious upstart who had reached too high. "Castle of Dreams becomes Tomb of Despair," read one headline. "Textile magnate's folly ends in tragedy," announced another. Some articles offered sympathy, portraying Malcolm as a victim of economic forces beyond his control, a man of vision destroyed by the Depression. But most were critical, using his story as a morality tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the futility of trying to buy one's way into social classes one had not been born into. The Fraser family, devastated and humiliated, retreated from public view. Margaret took Malcolm's 3 children, Margaret, age 12, William, age 10, and Duncan, just 6, to live with relatives in Edinburgh. The old manor house at Ridgefield stood empty. The unfinished castle loomed over it like an accusation. The legal aftermath took years to resolve. The estate was indeed seized by creditors and put up for sale in 1933, but there were no buyers. Who wanted a 70% complete castle with no clear purpose, requiring hundreds of thousands of pounds to finish and tens of thousands annually to maintain even in its incomplete state? The property languished. Local people began breaking in, not to vandalize but to salvage. Windows were pried out, copper plumbing was stripped for scrap value, lead flashing was pulled from the roof. Gradually, incrementally, the castle was being dismantled by the very people whose labor had built it, reclaiming materials that might have value in a desperate economy. The authorities made occasional efforts to secure the site, but it was impossible to guard such a large structure in so remote a location. By 1935, Castle Ridgefield was officially a ruin, open to the weather, its interior increasingly damaged by rain and snow that poured through gaps in the roof and broken windows. During the Second World War, the military briefly considered using the site for some purpose. There was talk of housing troops or storing equipment, but an engineering survey concluded that the building was too far deteriorated to be made safe or useful without massive investment. Instead, the estate's grounds were used for training exercises. Soldiers on maneuvers would occasionally take shelter in the more intact sections of the castle, and they left their own marks: graffiti, makeshift fireplaces, empty ammunition tins. After the war, the property was finally purchased for a nominal sum by a development company that planned to demolish the castle entirely and sell off the stone for reuse in other construction projects. It was a fate many ruined country houses suffered in post-war Britain, when estates were being broken up and the aristocratic world they represented was dying. But demolition proved more difficult and expensive than anticipated. The castle had been built too well. The dressed granite blocks, precisely cut and laid, were extraordinarily difficult to separate without damaging. The demolition crew made progress on the east wing, the least complete section, pulling down the steel frame and removing the partial stonework. But when they moved to the main structure, the work slowed to a crawl. Each section of wall required days to dismantle safely. The cost of demolition began to exceed the value of the salvaged stone. After 2 years of intermittent work, the company abandoned the effort, leaving Castle Ridgefield in a state of partial demolition, even more ruined than before, but still standing, still dominating the landscape with its broken towers and hollow walls. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Ridgefield became a local curiosity, a destination for the adventurous and the morbid. Teenagers would dare each other to spend nights in the ruins. Urban explorers, before that term existed, would document the decay with cameras, producing haunting images of nature reclaiming human ambition. Trees sprouted from cracks in the floors. Birds nested in the empty window frames. Ivy crawled up the granite walls, softening their harsh geometry. The castle became beautiful again, but in a way Malcolm Fraser would never have imagined or desired, beautiful in its surrender, its acceptance of impermanence, its transformation from monument to habitat. The Scottish weather, unforgiving and patient, continued its work, frost and rain and wind slowly eroding what human hands had struggled to create. The Fraser family never returned. Malcolm's children, raised in Edinburgh and later in England, wanted nothing to do with the place that had destroyed their father and stolen their inheritance. William Fraser, the elder son, became a teacher, living a modest, careful life as far from wealth and ambition as possible. Margaret married a shopkeeper and raised her children with stern warnings about the dangers of pride and the folly of trying to be something one was not. Duncan, the youngest, emigrated to Canada in the 1950s and rarely spoke of his family history. When asked, he would say only that his father had died when he was young, leaving out the circumstances, the castle, the tragedy of it all. The Fraser name, which Malcolm had dreamed of elevating to aristocratic prominence, faded into obscurity within a single generation. But Castle Ridgefield itself refused to disappear entirely. In the 1970s, as historic preservation movements gained strength across Britain, a few voices began to argue that the ruin had value and should be protected. It was, they pointed out, one of the last great examples of the Scottish baronial revival style, and despite its incompletion and decay, the quality of its stonework and the ambition of its design deserved recognition. In 1979, the remaining structure was granted scheduled monument status, legally protecting it from further demolition and requiring that any future changes be approved by heritage authorities. This was not restoration, there was no money or will for that, but it was preservation of a sort, an acknowledgement that ruins, too, can be historically significant, that failure and tragedy can teach as effectively as triumph. With legal protection came scholarly interest. Architectural historians began to study Castle Ridgefield seriously, producing papers and dissertations analyzing Halsey's designs, the construction techniques, the social and economic context of the project. What emerged from this research was a more nuanced understanding of Malcolm Fraser, neither the villain of contemporary accounts nor a tragic hero, but rather a complex man caught between worlds, too ambitious to be satisfied with his inherited status, too rooted in traditional notions of legitimacy to find fulfillment in his actual achievements, ultimately destroyed by his inability to see that the respect he craved could never be purchased with stone and mortar. One historian wrote that Fraser was a man born in the wrong era, pursuing medieval notions of legacy in an industrial age that had already made such dreams obsolete, even as it provided the wealth to attempt them. The castle's afterlife as a tourist attraction began quietly in the 1980s. The estate, still privately owned but now by a family with no connection to the Frasers, began allowing limited public access. There were no facilities, no gift shop or cafe, just a gravel car park and an unmanned gate with a donation box. Visitors came anyway, drawn by photographs in guidebooks and growing fascination with Britain's forgotten ruins. They wandered through the rootless rooms, climbed the crumbling stairs, stood in the magnificent entrance hall, now open to the sky, and tried to imagine what it had been meant to become. The experience was profound and melancholy, a meditation on ambition and impermanence unlike anything a completed, pristine building could offer. Some visitors left disturbed, unsettled by the waste and tragedy the ruins represented. Others found it strangely comforting, proof that even the grandest human endeavors are temporary, that failure is universal, that the natural world persists regardless of our dreams. In the 1990s, a small but dedicated group of enthusiasts formed the Ridgefield Trust, committed to stabilizing the ruins and preventing further decay. They raised funds through grants and donations, organized volunteer work parties to clear vegetation and repair dangerous sections of masonry, and lobbied for government support. Their efforts met with modest success. Sections of the castle were made structurally safe. Information plaques were installed, explaining the history and pointing out architectural features. A small visitor center was eventually built in the restored stable block, displaying some of the original architectural drawings, photographs from the construction period, and artifacts recovered from the site. The Trust's director, a retired architect named James MacLeod, became something of a public advocate for the castle, arguing that it deserved a place in the national conversation about heritage and memory. But what should that conversation be? This question has never been fully resolved. Castle Ridgefield resists simple narratives. It is not a monument to achievement, because it was never completed. It is not a memorial to tragedy, though tragedy saturates its history. It is not a cautionary tale, exactly, because the lesson it teaches is unclear. Should we condemn Malcolm Fraser's ambition as reckless vanity, or admire his willingness to risk everything for a vision, however impractical? Should we mourn the wasted resources and destroyed lives, or celebrate the spectacular beauty of what was created, however briefly? Should we see the ruins as evidence of human folly, or as testament to the undying human desire to build something that outlasts our fleeting lives? Perhaps the answer is that Castle Ridgefield is all these things simultaneously, and that its very ambiguity is what makes it powerful and important. In recent years, the castle has found new life in unexpected ways. It has become a popular location for photographers, especially those interested in ruin aesthetics and the intersection of nature and architecture. Its dramatic profile and haunting interiors provide striking backdrops for fashion shoots, music videos, and film productions. A Scottish novelist used it as the setting for a ghost story that became a bestseller, introducing the castle to audiences who had never heard of it and sparking renewed interest. Social media has also played a role, with images of Ridgefield regularly appearing on platforms dedicated to abandoned places and historical mysteries, accumulating thousands of shares and comments from people around the world who will likely never visit but are nonetheless moved by its story. The castle has even become a subject of philosophical inquiry. In 2018, a professor of architecture at the University of Edinburgh published a book examining unfinished buildings throughout history and what they reveal about human psychology and cultural values. He devoted an entire chapter to Castle Ridgefield, arguing that incompletion is not simply failure but a distinct category of architectural meaning. An unfinished building, he suggested, forces us to confront the gap between vision and reality, between aspiration and capability, in ways that completed buildings, however magnificent, do not. Standing in the ruins of Ridgefield, one sees both what was achieved and what was intended, both the grandeur realized and the grandeur forever lost. This double vision, the author argued, makes the castle more emotionally and intellectually engaging than many finished historic houses. It remains perpetually in a state of becoming, never allowed to settle into the comfortable status of accomplished fact. For the descendants of the men who built Castle Ridgefield, the ruins carry a different meaning. Several elderly residents of the surrounding villages remember their grandfathers or great-grandfathers working on the construction, and they possess a complicated pride in the connection. The castle is a monument to their ancestors' skill and labor, proof that working men from ordinary backgrounds created something of lasting beauty and power. But it also reminds them of exploitation and betrayal, wages unpaid, promises broken, a wealthy man's dream built on the backs of men who could not afford dreams of their own. One elderly mason, interviewed for a documentary in 2005, put it bluntly, "My grandfather gave 3 years of his life to that place, and he was never fully paid what he was owed. Malcolm Fraser stole from him, just as surely as if he'd picked his pocket. But when I walk through there now and see the stonework, the carving, the joints so tight you can't slip a knife blade between the blocks, I understand why my grandfather spoke of it until the day he died. He made something beautiful, even if the man who paid for it was a fool." The question of what to do with Castle Ridgefield long-term remains unresolved. Complete restoration is financially impossible. Estimates suggest it would cost upwards of £50 million to finish the building to anything resembling the original plans, and there is no practical purpose such a restoration would serve. No one needs a castle with 147 rooms in the modern Highland countryside. Some have proposed partial restoration, perhaps creating a museum or heritage center in the most intact sections while leaving other areas as stabilized ruins. Others argue that the castle is more valuable, more honest, as it currently stands, a ruin that tells a story about ambition and failure, wealth and waste, that no completed building could tell as effectively. The debate continues, reflecting broader questions about how societies should relate to their past, what they choose to preserve and why, what stories they want to tell about themselves. What cannot be debated is the castle's emotional impact. To stand in the roofless Great Hall, looking up at the sky through the intricate stonework that was meant to support a painted ceiling, is to feel time itself as a physical presence. The weight of decades presses down. The silence hums with absent voices. One imagines the workers who shaped these stones, the architect who drew the plans, the man who dreamed it all into existence. One thinks of Catherine Fraser, dead at 32, her memorial chapel standing incomplete and empty. One thinks of Malcolm's children, robbed of their father and their future, forced to carry the shame of his failure through their lives. One thinks of the dinner parties that were never held in the ballroom, the books never shelved in the library, the prayers never spoken in the chapel, the generations of Frasers who were supposed to walk these halls but never existed. The castle is haunted not by ghosts but by absences, by everything it was supposed to be and never became. On quiet days, when the Highland wind moves through the empty windows and the light slants through the broken roof, Castle Ridgefield achieves a strange grace. It no longer fights its fate. It has surrendered to time and weather, accepted its incompletion, found a new identity as a ruin. The granite, which Malcolm believed would last centuries, is indeed lasting, but in service of a story he never intended to tell. The building has become a collaboration between human ambition and natural process, between what we build and what time erases, between memory and forgetting. It is more powerful now, in its brokenness, than it ever would have been as the pristine palace Malcolm envisioned. Completeness would have made it merely impressive. Ruin has made it unforgettable. The tragedy of Castle Ridgefield is not that it was never finished, but that Malcolm Fraser could not see value in anything less than his impossible vision. He was a man who needed perfection, who believed that only absolute triumph would redeem his family's commercial origins and justify his existence. When circumstances made perfection unattainable, he chose death over accepting a more modest legacy. Yet the legacy he left is far richer and more complex than the simple aristocratic respectability he craved. His unfinished castle has become part of Scotland's cultural landscape, a landmark that prompts reflection, a monument that refuses to offer easy answers. Thousands of people visit each year, moved and unsettled by what they find. Malcolm Fraser failed to complete his castle, but in failing, he created something that completed castles rarely achieve, a structure that continues to provoke thought, emotion, and debate nearly a century after his death. What drives a man to sacrifice everything for a building? Perhaps it is the deeply human need to leave a mark, to create something that will outlast our brief lives and testify that we existed, that we mattered, that we were capable of greatness. Malcolm Fraser's great error was believing that stone alone could carry that message, that grandeur of scale could substitute for genuine achievement, that a building could redeem the shame he felt about his origins. He was wrong, but his mistake was not unique. Throughout history, countless individuals and societies have sought immortality through architecture, building ever larger, ever more elaborate structures, as if sufficient magnificence could conquer death itself. Most of those buildings have crumbled or burned or been torn down, forgotten despite the fortunes spent on their creation. The few that survive do so not because of their size or cost, but because they represent something genuine about the people who built them, their values, their fears, their dreams. Castle Ridgefield endures, incomplete and ruined, because it represents something genuine about Malcolm Fraser and the age in which he lived. It captures the tremendous social ambition of self-made men in the early 20th century, the belief that wealth could purchase not just comfort but status and respect. It reveals the fragility of that ambition, the ease with which it could be destroyed by economic forces beyond any individual's control. It demonstrates the human cost of obsession, the collateral damage inflicted on families and communities when one man's vision consumes all the resources around him. And it shows, with heartbreaking clarity, the futility of trying to build permanence in a world defined by change, to create monuments to stability in an era of revolution and collapse. The castle is a mirror, and what it reflects is uncomfortable, our own vanity, our own denial of mortality, our own desperate attempts to matter in a universe that will continue long after we have gone. But perhaps there is also something redemptive in the ruins. Castle Ridgefield was built on dreams of exclusivity and hierarchy, a monument to class ambition and social climbing. Its failure and abandonment stripped away those pretensions, leaving only the stone and the story. Now anyone can visit, regardless of wealth or status. The castle that was meant to separate Malcolm Fraser from common people has become, through its ruin, a common heritage, a place where anyone can walk and reflect on questions that transcend class. What matters in a life? What survives us? How do we measure success? Is beauty valuable even when impermanent, even when born from tragedy? The ruins democratize the experience in a way the completed palace never would have. There is a justice in that, an irony that Malcolm Fraser would have hated but that gives his story a dignity his life perhaps lacked. The sun sets early in the Highlands, especially in winter. As evening comes to Castle Ridgefield, the granite walls glow in the failing light, warm and almost alive. Shadows deepen in the empty halls. The wind picks up, making the building seem to sigh or breathe. A visitor standing in the entrance hall, looking up at the darkening sky through the absent roof, might feel many things: sorrow for wasted lives and squandered fortune, awe at the skill and beauty of the stonework, humility before the relentless passage of time, gratitude that the ruins have been preserved so that their story can continue to be told. They might think of Malcolm Fraser, alone in his temporary study on that frozen December morning, looking out at his unfinished dream and finding the weight of it unbearable. They might wonder what he would think if he could see the castle now, nearly a century later, still standing despite everything, still beautiful in its brokenness, still speaking to people he never knew and could never have imagined. They might wonder if he would still consider it a failure, or if he might, impossibly, understand that he built something more meaningful than he ever intended, not a monument to his own glory, but a testament to the complexity of human aspiration, the price of dreams, and the strange, unexpected life that buildings can have long after their creators are dust. Castle Ridgefield stands incomplete, and will stand incomplete forever. That is its story. That is its power. That is its truth. In a world obsessed with success and completion, with finished products and measurable achievements, the ruins insist on the value of the unfinished, the meaning embedded in failure, the beauty that can emerge from loss. The palace broke the Frasers, but the broken palace has given something back, a story, a lesson, a space for reflection, a reminder that even in our failures, especially in our failures, we reveal the most profound truths about what it means to be human, to dream, to build, to hope, and ultimately, to accept that nothing we create will last forever, and that perhaps that impermanence is not tragedy but simply the way of all things. The castle endures not despite its incompletion, but because of it. Malcolm Fraser did not build the monument to eternal glory he envisioned. He built something stranger and more lasting, a monument to the impossibility of such monuments, a palace that memorializes its own failure, and in doing so, achieves an immortality he never imagined.